Hi, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you for this really kind invitation to speak at the UK Forum for Cultural Diplomacy. There's so much that could be said about culture and cultural diplomacy, and what I want to do today is to stitch together quite briefly some of my work on nationalism and culture with one of the earliest tools of diplomacy, if not the earliest tool of diplomacy, food. And I want to set out an argument about how food, particularly the stuff that's thought of as national cuisine, in fact shows us the fictive quality of the nation and of borders, of how it's imagined. And I think the way to do that is by doing something that's surprisingly not very often done in lots of academic work, and that is to pay attention to the very real, material, physical work that goes into making food. So all of that is to say that I'm not just interested in the act of breaking bread together, as we're familiar with. I'm not just interested in the act of breaking bread together, which is so key to diplomacy. I'm more interested in the baking of bread. Right? I'm more interested in the labor that goes into breaking the bread, as it were. And I'll use that to try and sketch out an argument about nationalism. There's a Japanese cafe in Athens called Soya. It's a small place. They sell plenty of quintessentially Japanese ingredients and food, and they're supported by the Japanese embassy in Greece, right? Essentially the Japanese state. This is not something that's unique to Japan. There are, other countries do similar things. There's a Malaysia Hall canteen that used to be just around the corner at Bayswater. It was supported by the Malaysian government, though I was recently told that it had closed down permanently, which is quite tragic because the food was very good. There's a new Singaporean food hall in Piccadilly in central London called Singapula. That's supported by the country's Economic Development Board. Now, all of these instances are examples of something called gastrodiplomacy. And that's not a new term, that's a term that was coined by The Economist in 2002, when they were writing about something called the Global Thai Program, which was essentially a set of state measures the Thai government had introduced to support Thai restaurants and eateries abroad. So back then, more than 20 years ago, gastrodiplomacy was a novel concept. There was a way of doing soft power to strengthen bilateral relations. And since then, other countries have, if not quite jumped, but certainly boarded this bandwagon of gastrodiplomacy. And it's become relatively more common. What I'm interested in are the moments where gastrodiplomacy might slide into what the sociologist Michela De Soucy calls gastronationalism. Particularly when states begin to exert a force around what counts, and by extension what doesn't count as authentic. Authentic food that belongs to a certain culture, belongs to a certain cuisine. When states begin to obsess over a so-called national identity that can be expressed through cuisine. When they begin to obsess over that. And I want to suggest that actually what it shows is that the nation is not this uniform, coherent entity with a fixed set of practices that everyone shares and subscribes to. It's something that is far more ethereal and doesn't conform to borders. It escapes the border. So let me start by saying something about nations and nationalism. I won't go into this very much. I've done that elsewhere. You can find that on YouTube and stuff if you want. But basically, the big snake oil that the adherents of nationalism peddle is that if various foreign elements that don't belong within the nation can be expunged from the nation state, then it can be restored to some kind of imagined, previously pristine condition. Now, that is a political fantasy. It's a very contagious political fantasy with often quite deadly consequences, but it's nonetheless a fantasy. And there's a secondary version of dealing with the nation that's relatively seductive. In 2020, in the lead up to the US presidential election, there was an op-ed in the New York Times. It was called, "Don't Let Nationalists Speak for the Nation." And its main claim was that the antidote to nationalism was patriotism, expressing one's love and belonging for your country. And it's quite a tempting way to approach the nation, kind of an antidote. It offers itself up as an antidote to the hate that nationalism normally expresses. I think part of the reason these feelings of love and national belonging can appear quite harmless is that love and belonging is normally experienced interpersonally. You share feelings of amity and love with the important people in your life. There's an affinity amongst friends, family, any number of communities with shared heritage or hobbies. Both of these ways of dealing with the nation, however, essentially rely on imagining the nation as this stable, uniform, coherent entity with a fixed set of practices that everyone shares and subscribes to. And this is what my friend, the scholar of nationalism, Sivamohan Vallabhan, calls the complacency around the nation. And it's a complacency, he says, that stems from a simple misunderstanding. It's a misunderstanding of the nation as a politics of belonging, as opposed to a politics of enmity. End quote. It's obsessed. The state is obsessed with so-called outsiders and enemies and those who don't belong because there's actually no way there's no stable way to express belonging. And so I've become increasingly intrigued by how food and cuisine is often co-opted into discourses around nation and culture, often via gastro-diplomatic maneuvers that try to leverage this idea that a certain dish belongs to a nation state and its culture. In the wonderful Vittles magazine, Dan Hong writes about this slippage, and he says, again, begin quote, "The way that food is associated with identity, combined with diplomacy's pursuit of the national interest, means that gastrodiplomacy will always have at least a tinge of nationalism," end quote. And I suppose it's maybe a little optimistic to say it's only a tinge. Dan talks about attending an exhibition in Marseille about the Mediterranean diet. Right? And he says it showed many elements of Mediterranean food culture that carried over into traditional French farming practices and principles of communal eating. But, however, he says it was comparatively silent on the historic role of colonialism and the migration of Muslims, Arabs, and Jews in the formation of the Mediterranean diet. And we could also look a little bit less further away. The drink that's taken as the bearer of tradition on these shores is tea. Chicken tikka masala, as the Foreign Secretary famously declared in 2001, is considered a national dish, symbolic of multicultural Britain. The catch, right, what is left out, is of course that neither tea nor spices is indigenous to the UK. They ended up here because of its previous adventures, should we say, in India, right? And in that sense, the narrative of how this food and drink have become representative of British culture cannot really be told accurately without talking about imperial history. However, this is quite crucial. Very often, that is exactly how it's told. That's precisely how that story is told and precisely how that narrative is put together. Something must be left out of the narrative around cuisine and tradition and culture for that all to cohere seamlessly. And I think that tells us two things about nations and nationalism. The first is that these things that we think of as part of timeless national culture, they're actively made, created, invented. But I think we already knew that. The second thing is the foods and flavors around which these feelings of belonging supposedly coalesce don't neatly cohere with state and territorial borders. And the border is the thing that I'm particularly concerned with, because that is what states tend to operationalize to quite violent ends. And to see how food and ideas of national culture don't easily cohere, I think we have to stop thinking about food in this abstract sense, as if it's something that magically appears on the table out of thin air, waiting to be eaten, and then maybe do its so-called cultural work. Rebecca May Johnson makes this point in her book called Small Fires. She says, imagining food as a, quote, linguistic apparition hinders any kind of useful insight. And food is a real thing, right? It's made by real hands, by real people. Flavor comes out of labor. The bread that is famously broken together as part of cultural diplomacy by people sitting at the same table has to be made by a baker in a kitchen, supported by a range of other workers who must sow and harvest and mill the wheat, pack and transport it before the dough can be mixed and shaped and baked and plated before it's served at the table. And in place of bread, obviously, one can substitute any number of foods and many units of labor. I think this is where you start to see the fraying of how the nation is imagined, because plenty of this labor, in fact, in all likelihood, the majority of this labor crosses borders. If you think of a nice restaurant in London, for example, chances are it functions on a bedrock of South American preppers and kitchen porters. But beyond that, even in smaller establishments that might not directly employ migrant workers, consider the raw ingredients that they use, right? The suppliers that they call on, the equipment that they have to work with. It's quite clear that at least some of the labor that goes into building flavor belongs to people from so-called elsewhere. And I think that's a particularly important thing to say, particularly as we're speaking in the aftermath of far-right violence and race riots that were directed at migrants and ethnic minorities up and down this country just a couple of weeks ago. And I'm not sure if riots is sufficiently grave enough a word to capture the act of trying to burn down a building that's filled with people. But in any case, I think when we understand food as something real, as the product of a material process, and as involving real people in that material process, across border lines and cultures, the supposed coherence of the nation, the fiction of that nation, begins to give way. These things that gastrodiplomacy suggests can sit neatly within the confines of a nation state, within its borders, whether that's risotto or pad thai or kung pao chicken or chicken tikka masala, they in fact escape its borders. They're uncontainable within what are ultimately quite artificial lines. Which is not to say that these artificial lines don't have power. They do have lots of power to quite grave consequences, but they are fundamentally made up. And another place where we see the apparent neatness of the nation disrupted is, I think, food in the home. And again, by thinking about the process of making it, cooking it. Every home will have its version of some well-known recipe, its own style of making a certain dish that everyone swears by. Whether that's gnocchi or empanadas or biryani, there will be a recipe that your home swears by. In all likelihood, it's a recipe that's been passed down by a mother or a grandmother or a great-grandmother. Less likely a father or grandfather. And that's an important point. One of the 2 points I want to make. The first is the malleability of so-called national cuisine. Right? It changes. Everyone's got a different version of it. And by extension, what you understand as the nation is also therefore malleable, despite what the state tries to say. It is quite malleable. One person might choose to add raisins to their biryani, where someone else will say that's a travesty, and they both nominally will come from the same country and same culture. There's no original, true, authentic recipe, much as many try to claim that there is. And the same can be said about country and culture. How something is made in the north will differ from how it's made in the south, in the west, in the east. There will be differences, inevitably. And if you talk to people, they will readily acknowledge this. They will tell you that there are differences. How flatbread is made in the west is different from how it's made in the east. They will tell you this. National cuisine, like the nation, or like the nation state, and like culture, is not this uniform thing, despite what states try to say, despite what nationalists claim. Even though it's imagined in that way, it's filled and replete with differences and diversity. And food, quite simply, does not correspond to borders. And the second thing about home cooking is that historically, the labor of making food at home has been, and continues to be, overwhelmingly gendered. These obligations have been placed disproportionately on women. And there's a lot to be said about that unfairness, right? But let's just take at face value for a moment the claim that national cuisine, certain national food, certain dish, is this uniformly delicious thing that everyone in the nation supposedly adores. How do we square that with the fact that the vast majority of men who supposedly belong to this nation and its cuisine not only don't participate in the cooking, they aren't even capable of describing this food? This is what I mean by thinking about the actual making of food, the actual material process of it, the labor that goes into cooking and who is doing it. Because it's very difficult to take seriously the idea that a certain dish can supposedly be representative of an entire nation within a certain set of borders, when approximately half of the members who live within those borders can't even tell you what goes into it. The main thing, and I'm going to wrap up with this point, the main thing that gastrodiplomacy claims to do is diplomacy through food. Sharing national dishes is portrayed as a path to melting differences and breaking down borders. States and diplomats and embassies invest in it because it's supposedly a way of shoring up soft power, winning hearts and minds via a detour through stomachs. But it's logic. The logic there only really holds up when flavor is divorced from labor. When we think of food as a dematerialized thing, a soulless, ghost-like entity that magically appears, ready to do all of this work of bringing people together, when we think of flavors in all of their fullness, made by real people, from beginning to end, what they really do is give the lie to the idea that cuisine can be mapped in any sort of coherent way onto a bordered territory. It's in this sense, I think, that gastrodiplomacy really breaks down borders. It shows us quite literally the invalidity of the border in determining things like belonging, who belongs in a certain territory. And if anything, what it does is it shows us the profound interconnectedness of communities beyond these fictive things that we understand as nation states. Discourses around the nation and national cuisine tend to function on a veneer of uniformity, and they harness all sorts of feelings of belonging around that. But when you think about it, the nation is replete with all kinds of differences and diversities and divergences around language, cultural practices, celebrations, holidays, and food that are quite often overlooked, so that this apparent matching congruence of the nation state can make sense. It doesn't map so neatly onto the borders of a particular state. Culture is way too powerful for that. It escapes the borders of a state. Nationalism's great trick is to pretend like the political unit of the nation belongs within the same matrix of cultural or interpersonal belonging as our other individual personal relationships do. And if there's anything that gastrodiplomacy does, it's to show that actually it doesn't. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank again the doctor. If you could just wait a moment for some questions or comments. Are there any questions or comments?
Thank you very much, and I acknowledge the angle from which you took it from. I did not expect it. I was expecting you at least to mention jollof rice, which is now associated with my country, Ghana.
Sure.
It's not Nigeria, it's Ghana. Don't worry. These are things we hitherto do not pay much attention to, but ultimately contribute to our being and in everything we do. There is, I think in the late 90s in Ghana, for instance, you will hear of a Chinese restaurant. 3 days ago, I had my supper in an Indian restaurant here in the UK.
Yeah.
These are things that do not feature in the writings of diplomacy. But wherever diplomats go, wherever community go, they follow them. I think it's about time those of you in academic took these things very, very seriously. We could have a comprehensive view of diplomacy and all that it entails. I'm grateful. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Are there any further questions, comments for the doctor? Okay. Captain Ali? Says,
Very important part of culture is food, and it brings people together. So
Thank you.
very, very, very well.
Thank you.
Hi, I'd just like to make
Hi.
a comment.
Sure.
I work in the field of interfaith, bringing lots of different religions together. And from my perspective, I think one of the most powerful things is, you have an event and then people bring dishes from different cultures, different religions, and somehow it does exactly what you said. It just melts differences, because then you stand in front of another human,
Yeah.
another person from this world. The beliefs and the roots kind of dissolve. So, and it's a very powerful tool in interfaith.
Yeah, I think it's worth just reiterating that point, like that food has got this powerful, very profound connection that it allows us to make across people, right? And it allows us to foster that kind of connection. I think in my brief remarks, what I was trying to get at was I guess I would say it's my suspicion when states get involved and try to map foods onto political units, and they try to operationalize it for division rather than bringing people together. Because I think when you actually look at how food is experienced and enjoyed, it just, exactly as you put it, it just shows that things like division across a frontier that has been created quite arbitrarily, does not quite hold. That difference doesn't quite hold, because there are profoundly more important ways in which we're connected together. Yeah, absolutely, I fully agree with that. Thanks for that.
I have a question.
Absolutely.
The way you've broken down gastro diplomacy from the flavor
Yeah.
to the labor, and we do know that a lot of these constructs, even the nation states, especially from the conference in Berlin, are false things. But then don't you feel that it begins to dilute the essence of diplomacy, because diplomacy is normally dealt with the false constructs of nation states rather than family entities? And if you then go, even though it's as valid, just for the essence of broad speaking, I mean, much more the forest than the tree,
Yeah.
then we can begin to say that the Mercedes-Benz, again, will not be a technological, diplomatic thing of the Germans, knowing in the multinational states that different parts come from different corners of the world. And then where do we end? That the cream you use from your hair is shea butter from West Africa, so your hair is not authentically your hair because it's this thing. Where do we kind of put a full stop to the concept, as valid as it is, as a working tool for solutions?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and I think like actually what that sort of illustrates is the ways in which we are all kind of interconnected, and as you put it, I wouldn't say the falseness of the nation state, but it's constructed, it's artificial in that sense, and it's a very powerful artificial construct, because it's an artificial construct that's got militaries behind it that can defend it and kill. I think my unease is when a political unit and a state says that a certain dish can belong to it in some way that it can then use to continue to strengthen, fortify its own borders. I think that is a little bit invalid, because when you start to look at exactly how that dish is put together, how it's brought together, and the people that make it, there are usually hands involved that go beyond the borders of whichever state you happen to represent. So I don't think it's a case of searching for authenticity or a certain point of origin. I'm not particularly concerned with that. But when states try to rely on this logic that this food belongs to us, and therefore we can strengthen the discourse around belonging and our borders, I think there is where you start to see some disturbances.
Thank you very much. We'll take two more, three. Okay. We'll take three in a series, and then he can answer them all, and then we'll close out. So, pardon the gentleman here and the lovely gentleman there.
Thank you, Doc. The politics of the stomach, gastro diplomacy. just want to find out, because from a political angle,
Sure.
food is used for campaign purposes, and it's amazing how it can literally drive politics. And also the withdrawal of it can also influence politics. What's your take on that aspect when dishes are politicized or weaponized, if I may call it, for purposes of campaign?
Thank you. Just a quick question. Would you say that then maybe the most effective way to think about using food in diplomacy is to start with the recognition that there is no such thing as a national dish? Because once we start there, we can come together much more easily.
And we'll take the third
Excellent question, yeah.
one will be over here.
Yes, hello. My name is Mozdam Ali Sandhu. I'm consular from Barking and Dagenham. It was just a quick decision to take part in these lovely discussions. I have one question and two comments. So one comment is, in our Pakistan, the Asian families, the mother always teach their daughter when they're going to marry, to learn make good dishes, good food, because the passage of heart comes from stomach. If you are a good cook, then you can win your husband's heart. So this is one of the good things. The second thing is we have seen so much close shared values between Pakistan and India. We have almost same culture, same food. We used to have a cricket diplomacy. Now you introduced the food diplomacy.
Yeah.
But this food diplomacy completely failed between Pakistan and India. We have all the dishes same. If you go to any Pakistani restaurant and any Indian restaurant, you find 99% similar dishes. But this diplomacy between these two countries, even we share the longest borders, longest relationship, we speak same language, but unfortunately this diplomacy failed. So can you provide any reason of that? Thank you.
So you have three lovely questions.
Yeah, excellent questions. So I guess maybe we'll start with your question, which was, I think which I think is also kind of related to the other question as well. So in fact, I can take them both together, because that question was to do with, would you say that there's no such thing as a national dish? And I think the short answer is yes. Because the question with what counts as a national dish really means you need to kind of take a step back and look at the state that has decided some kind of dish, some recognized dish, some recipe is going to be elevated above all others for some reason, and that's going to be called the national dish, even though across the entire country, not everyone's going to be making food in that same way, right? Whether that's like the examples I gave, risotto or pizza or empanadas, whatever. People make them differently. So there isn't actually a kind of coherent concept of a national dish. It's the dish that the state claims is the national dish. So then we can kind of make a detour to the point that you made. What do we do about states that try to use food to fortify their own political power? I think we begin from understanding that food is a much more fluid concept that cannot be contained within borders. By doing things like precisely rejecting ideas of there being this one static, uniform national dish that everyone supposedly adores, because that concept is just not true. Now, I should say that my expertise is not really in gastrodiplomacy. It's a term that the Economist coined in 2002. Like I said in the talk, I'm more interested in the moments where food and nationalism can come together in ways that I'm not very comfortable with. Gastro-nationalism, as I said. It's got its kind of uses in diplomatic circles, I'm sure, but I guess the catch is that diplomacy functions on the logic of the nation-state system. And as we've kind of talked about before, the nation-state system is a set of arbitrary lines, but very powerful arbitrary lines. Diplomacy has got its role within that, ensuring peace, ensuring that, you know, the sort of militaries that exist to defend these lines don't exert violence on people. So diplomacy has got its role. My kind of discomfort is when states try to exert a kind of exclusionary force around food, and when they try to say that a certain dish is the way that it's meant to be cooked, and if it's not that way, then the people who are doing that don't belong to this state, which I think allows me to segue to your point, which is that India and Pakistan share loads of dishes, which is true. Like, I think it's, if you were to walk into a Indian restaurant or a Pakistani restaurant and you did not know what it was, you ordered dishes and you ate it, you would not be able to say if it was Indian food or Pakistani food. I think what explains I'm not familiar with the example you've outlined, right? But from how you've described it, I think the explanation is coming back to political power and the relative political power between India and Pakistan. Which state is able to expend more resources into branding a certain dish as Indian rather than Pakistani? The last thing I wanted to say is I think it's a really important aspect of various traditions that mothers teach their daughters how to cook as an expression of care. I also think they should teach their sons to cook, because why shouldn't husbands also care for their wives and their partners? I come from a home in which my uncle was a very, very active cook in the house, and I live with my partner, who I'm very proud to say we cook and bake bread together daily, and that's a profound act of love and care. And I think it's something that everyone should do. I think what we should not be doing is ascribing a certain role to simply one person, right? I think it's a lovely tradition. I think it should be expanded beyond just women and daughters to fathers and sons. I think have I covered all the 3 points? I think so. Okay, thank you so very much.
Thank you again. Thank you, Dr. Pavan Mano. Thank you ever so much.